Hi, my name is Lisbeth, and today we're going to be going over carbohydrates. So I'm sure you've heard of carbohydrates, right? They're found in food, carbs. A lot of people avoid them. Some people just love them, right? They're found in bread, and they're found in potatoes, and they're found in all of that. And they're actually used for energy in the body, even though you might not feel like it, because sometimes when you eat a lot of pasta, you fall into a food coma, right? But it's okay. We're going to talk over the basic structure. So we're going to talk about the monomer. We're going to talk about what kind of bond type there is, the components. We're going to go over some examples, functions, etc., etc. So the first thing we need to know is the monomer. I'm actually doing videos on all of the macromolecules, and something that's you need to know is the monomer, the type of bond, and extra information. So these videos are actually going to be very helpful for exams, right? So the monomer for carbohydrates, what is a monomer? It's the most basic structure of the macromolecule. So macro means big, right? And a molecule is a molecule. It's a big molecule. So big things are usually made up of small things. We learned that in chapter 1, right? So life kind of goes to this building up scale. So this is going to be like the most basic component of this macromolecule, and that's going to be a monosaccharide or a glucose. Monosaccharide. That's just going to be a basic sugar. So think of glucose, galactose, mannose, ribose. Anything that ends in ose is usually going to be one of your monomers. What a monomer does is that it'll make linkages within each other. So those are going to be the bond type. And in carbohydrates, those are going to be called glycosidic linkages. Glycosidic linkages. So glyco in biology means sugar. Who would have thought, right? So these are sugar linkages. So let's say you have a glucose molecule, and I'm going to draw a structure. Don't freak out about it. It's just sugar, right? Don't think too much about it, right? So you're going to have your CH2OH up here. You're going to have OH, OH, OH. And then here it's going to create a bond with another molecule. It's another sugar. Right? This here is what would be called a glycosidic linkage. So it's just connecting two sugars together. And actually, since there's two sugars, this is actually a disaccharide. Di means two. And then you can add another one if you'd like, and then you have a polysaccharide. Poly means many, or at least more than two, right? But we're going to go over all the mono, di, tri stuff in a second. So the basic components of sugars, So what exactly are sugars made up of, right? I drew these hexagon-looking things, but what are they, right? And each little corner here, you actually have a carbon. So one of the main components of sugars is carbon, which is why we dedicate a whole chapter in biology to carbon, right? So we have carbon, we have hydrogens, as you can see here. Usually these two go hand in hand. If you have carbons, you're usually going to have hydrogens. And we also have oxygens here. The presence of oxygens is actually what kind of differentiates sugars from lipids. Lipids only have carbons and hydrogens, while carbohydrates will have oxygens in them. So that's pretty cool. And the reason for that is there's like oxidations happening here, but we're not going to get into that. So the basic components are carbons, hydrogens, and oxygens. Let's go into some examples of sugars. Right, we have our monosaccharides, which I basically drew out here for you. And I'm just going to short that to mono. So this would be just like a glucose, mannose, galactose, etc., etc., etc. There's a bunch of sugars, so just keep in mind. And the main function of these is for fuel, right? So they're what fuel our bodies. When you give a little kid sugar, what happens? They go crazy. They start jumping off walls, and next thing you know, like It's just not a good time. They're just having a blast, but you're not, right? So they're fuel. Our body burns through this. Later on in biology, you're going to learn about something called cellular respiration, and that's how we use glucose for fuel, for energy, right? So you also have disaccharides. Disaccharides is this. It's two of them together, and they're also used for fuel. All right, and then you have polysaccharides. So that's going to be many of them, and those are usually used for storage and strengthening. That's very different from fuel, right? So let's go over some examples of these guys. For storage, we actually have something called starch. And I'm sure you've heard of starch. They're in potatoes, right? So when you think of starch, think of potatoes. It's found in plants. So what happens when you have starch is that a plant will go through its life cycle and it's going to collect more sugars or make more sugars than it actually needs. But let's say a drought happens or doesn't have the right nutrients. That starch is going to be able to convert into sugar so that it's able to go through cellular respiration and not die, right? So starch is just the storage of sugars, and it can be transverted into each thing. So if I have starch, I can convert it to glucose, and I can convert glucose back to starch as well. So us animals also have an equivalent to starch. It's called glycogen. So let's say you've eaten a bunch of sugar or a bunch of pasta, a bunch of potatoes, stuff like that. You have all of this sugar in your body. Your body is not going to use all of it for energy all at once. So what it's going to do is that it's actually going to convert it into glycogen. When you go into starvation mode, your body will go ahead and use that glycogen, break it down back into glucose so that you can keep going. This is how, if you ever fast, so if you do like intermittent fasting, your body will start using up that glycogen for energy. All right, so for strengthening, we have something called cellulose in plants. So when you think of starch, glycogen, cellulose, and eventually chitin, this is found in insects. I want you to have an image in your head that's like this, but thousands of them. These things are huge. So cellulose makes up the cell wall of plants, and it's actually why we can't digest plants. So if you ever have like gastro issues, so like stomach problems, people might tell you to eat more fiber. That's actually basically telling you to eat more cellulose. Cellulose is an insoluble fiber, which means it cannot be dissolved in our bodies. There aren't very many animals who can actually digest cellulose. So what happens is that this cellulose you'll eat it in the form of like spinach. Anything green really has cellulose. You'll eat it and it'll go through your intestinal tract, and it'll actually cause abrasions to your intestinal tract. That means it'll kind of like rub up against it and maybe kind of bother it enough that it'll secrete mucus, which promotes a healthy digestive tract. So other food can move along smoothly. I think this is why they always try to give us salads before we eat, so that it doesn't get stuck in our stomachs, right? Chitin is something that's very, very strong. It actually forms a very, very strong substance, and that's what's found in like spiders and anything else that's crunchy. When you step on it, that has chitin in it. So let's go over a little recap of these carbs. The monomer is going to be a monosaccharide. The bond type is a glycosidic linkage. Those are the most, if you're going to get anything, these are the most important things to remember about carbohydrates. They're made up of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygens. And then we have our examples of monosaccharides, disaccharides, and polysaccharides. And these are different. The storage is different in animals and plants. We don't store our sugars in starch. We store it in the form of glycogen, and plants do not store glycogen. They only store starch. And then we also have the strength of cellulose and chitin. So that's basically an overview of carbohydrates.